Okay, so let's try to get through these sources. So as I said, last time we dealt with the question of whether what kosher concerns can come out with genetically modified foods. But the question really you have to ask before that is it halachically or maybe hashkafically problematic to create these foods in the first place? And again, genetically modified foods can include a variety of different things, and it can include inserting genes from animals into plants, changing the plant genomes or the animal genomes to propagate certain traits. So the possible prohibition that could be in place is Kilayim. Now, normally when we think of Kilayim, the one we non-farmers are most affiliated with is Kilayim Begadim, what we know as Sha'anez, right? But another one is planting different species together. So if you look at number 2, the Torah tells you, "Chukotai tishmoru be'amtechalo tarbia kilayim, tzadchalo tizra kilayim uveged kilayim sha'atnez lo yale alecha." You can't crossbreed animals to create kilayim. You can't crossbreed species to create kilayim, and you can't wear kilayim. So, one second. Ken. אני מושג. מה השם? יהודית. Yudit? Is Yudit here? Yes, Yudit. Is there a Yudit amongst the students or just Yudit? Okay. היא לא פה עכשיו, אבל אני... תודה. Okay. Someone give this to whoever when it's time. It's not a rush on what it looks like. Baked goods. What? It's baked goods. I'm assuming in honor of Rosh Chodesh, but I don't know. It's Rosh Chodesh tonight. I'm just guessing that's what it's for. I don't know. I don't actually know, but I don't know if I'm supposed to. They brought something from the bakery here. I put it over here. Okay. It is a dar. It says what it is on it, but I won't say. That's fine. That's fine. Okay, fine. So in the Kilayim, so the classic Gemara is the following. The Gemara number 3 tells you that, or the Mishnah in the Gemara, Shishat Dvarim Asu Anshe Yericho. There were 6 practices the people of Yericho did. There were 3 that the rabbis were okay with, 3 that they were not okay with, and they protested. To protest. Protest, yes. 3 that they protested and 3 that they did not. So, I did not translation. Okay, that's fine. Fine. So the elu shalom yichul b'yadam. The first thing that they did not protest is markivin dekalim kolayim, is that they would graft all day from these palm trees. So the Gemara says markivin dekalim kolayim. Hechi avdi, what are you talking about? When is it not a problem to graft? What was the case? So Amr Yehuda might be asa dora v'shichra d'dafna v'kimcha d'sarei d'rama b'mana. So as the English tells you here, because this is not words I expect anybody to know, right, is they brought fresh myrtle, strong beer made from the fruit of the laurel tree, and barley flour that's cast into a vessel, and 40 days had not passed since it was ground. They boiled them together and poured the mixture into the core of the palm tree. And if they hadn't done it, and they would pour it around the trees within Arba Amon, if they hadn't done it, the other trees would wither because it would have given such a kick to the tree that it would have overpowered the trees next to it. Or they placed a branch of a male palm tree on the female so that it would yield fruit. Now, why is this irrelevant? Because at first glance, right, the classic case of planting is where you plant them all together in the same field, or you graft them together. And yet here, there seems to be some sort of early, not exactly genetic modification, but they are putting other species directly into the sap of the tree, and the Gemara says that's not a problem. Right? So does this indicate that whatever the problem of Kilayim is, it is limited to actually planting things together rather than inserting genetic material from one plant into another, in which case, presumably, creating a GMO in that way would be fine. Because in general, right, what you're not allowed to do is aim to be an ilan be'ilan, and the Mishnah tells you in 4, can't bring a tree to a tree, yarek be'yarek, vo ilan be'yarek, vo yarek be'ilan, Yehuda matir yarek be'ilan. The one case of Yehuda allows this mixing is a vegetable in a tree. And the Tosafot Yom Tov, their comments, V'hainish Zuvarid Dafka Keshal Yidei Harkava Hein Mitachin V'nas Leidin Pri O Yarek Mishuneh Bahu Asra Torah Mishum Kilayim. He says the only time, Yehuda thinks the only time it's problematic is when a new fruit is created. V'zeh Dafka B'ilan V'ilan O Yarek V'yarek. That's only 2 different trees or 2 different vegetables. Aval Yarek V'ilan Sheina Mitachin Lishtanot. But when they merely get some sustenance from each other, but doesn't create a new species, so then it's going to be fine. So again, you have to ask, presumably when we're doing it, you're not really creating a new species that way, right? You're creating changing the properties maybe in the vegetable, but it doesn't seem to be creating a new one in quite the same way. I mean, maybe it could be. But these are the sources that are in the background of the question. So if you look at Rav Bakshi Doron number 6, he was asked, is genetically engineering a vegetable, a fruit, is that asur because of the kilayim? So he says, the first question you have to ask, is it prohibited to create these joint fruits or vegetables because of kilayim? You're not allowed to mix 2 things, create a new species. So he said the first thing you have to note, and this seems to be what emerges from the Sugya in Psachim, he argues that Kilayim is only the act, not the result. Meaning, the simple fact that you are melding 2 things together is not the problem. It's the act of grafting or the act of planting them together, thereby creating a new species. That is the problem of Kilayim. But simply managing to create that result, he thinks is not the problem. And therefore the case is only where I actually take a tree and attach it to a tree, or a vegetable to a vegetable. But in order to genetically modify, you either use for him it's a chaydak. I don't know if it's really a chaydak, right? A virus, a bacteria. It's not really what you do, but okay, right? Or you, right? Or you just manipulate it in a petri dish or whatever the case may be, right? You manipulate the genes. And the gene is not itself a plant. It is not seen. It doesn't have independent standing. And there is no problem of just helping something grow by inserting chemicals. Even if you get it from other trees. Right, so the way Rav Bakshi Doron takes these sugyas is what you learn from the Gemara in Psachim, that it's not simply the result of having created a new species. There has to be an act of cross-breeding. And cross-breeding in halacha requires actually taking 2 plants, growing them together, but merely introducing new genetic material, he thinks does not fall under the prohibition because it has the result without the action, and for him, the action is what makes it problematic. Okay? Yeah. Engineering. Yeah, Mehandes is an engineer, Handasa is engineering. So Handasa Genetis is genetic engineering. Good word to know in modern Hebrew. Yeah.
Question. I mean, this is also like this is also taking source lines, which that's now we're
Correct.
So this issue and taking the so this person in the act of creation issue is it taking it from.
It's not the act of creation, it's the act of cross-planting, and that's why he thinks this is not a problem. Right? Right. Rabashi Daron says it's not a problem. It's not result-oriented, it's action-oriented. It's the specific action of planting them together. Okay? Right? Now. Okay, yeah. We'll clarify that now, yes.
Yeah, so I was wondering how that would play, how like, if it can be made in the lab, how that would change.
Okay, good. So hold that for a second. So that's how Rabashi Daron takes it. However, that's not the only way of taking it. Now, before we look at the Chazon Ish, look at Rav Shlomo Zalman. Look at 8. Rav Shlomo Zalman also thinks it's not a problem. Why not? Because he says as follows. He says, "Be'enyan she'elato b'davar handasa genetik, shemachnisin chalkikei te'im v'rbiya achad l'shniyah." That you take cells from one to another. Thereby changing the nature of the second species. And therefore you want to essentially permit Kilayim because these cells are not seen by the human eye. Since people move these cells, these molecules from one to the other, he says, first of all, I think they are visible because it's not like it's happening by itself, right? The person, the scientist is there, he's seeing it, he's actively doing it. So don't just tell me that you can't just get away by it by saying it's invisible. That doesn't work because you're actually relating it to it as visible, right? You're looking under a microscope in order to actively be involved in it. So invisibility is not going to help you. He said maybe by bugs, right? He says, you can't have vegetables with bugs, but you can have vegetables with bacteria on them. You shouldn't maybe, but different story. But halachically, it's fine. And obviously we do, right? Everything has some sort of something on it. He said that's because you're not relating directly to these things. But when you're actively relating to them, so you can't just get away by saying it's invisible. כיוון שזה רק על ידי העברת חומר ממין אחד תוך מין בעל חי אחר. ורק בהרכבת עצים נראית לשפיר הצורה אף אם ההרכבה היא רק על ידי זריקה של מיץ, אשר אם היה זורע המיץ באדמה לא צומח כלל, כי סוף סוף השדה לא משני מינים. מה שאין כן בהרבעה, הרי התורה אמרה בהמתחה ואין זו בהמה ואין זה שייך כלל איסור הבאה, זה אסרה רק שתי גופות ממש. So sorry, Rav Shlomo Zalman splits the difference. He says, you know what, I think that when it comes to plants, it actually is forbidden. You know why I think it's forbidden? Because you can see it, you're actively doing it, and he distinguishes. He says, by animals, right, Rabashi Daron says, by Kilayim, the Isser is creating it through crossbreeding or cross-planting or whatever, but not creating the result. And therefore, genetic engineering is totally mutter. Rav Shlomo Zalman says, no. He says, I agree with Rabashi Daron when it comes to animals. By animals, it's only usher if you crossbreed them. But by plants, he says, it's about results. Did I have two species growing together? And therefore, he thinks that it would be forbidden. Now, and this is where, in Akiva Wolf's article, he suggests, they put in 9, that maybe even Rav Shlomo Zalman would only hold its usher the first time around, meaning when you're taking the actual genetic material from one plant and putting it in another. But if you took the genetic material and then you processed it in a lab and then duplicated it, right? That, he thinks, would not be a problem, even according to Rishon Zalman, because then what you inserted, the genes that you inserted, are not the original genes from the first plant. They're just the genetic duplicates. So, from a scientific view, they're the same thing. But from a halachic view, it's no longer the first vegetable going into the second vegetable, right? It's just genetic material. So the original material, he thinks, according to Rishon Zalman, would be forbidden only in plants, but not in animals. But he thinks the genetically recreated, right, the duplicates, so then he thinks would be mutter, even according to Rishon Zalman, even in plants. So let's now go back to the Chazon Ish, in number 7. Now, where would you get this idea? So this, you could read this as the Tosafot Yom Tov, right? Because the Tosafot Yom Tov does seem to focus on the result, right? That the produce is now a different plant. So if you read that as really telling you that, at least by plants, it's result-oriented rather than process-oriented, so then you could come to the conclusion of Rishon Zalman. So what does the Chazon Ish say in 7? Chazon Ish says as follows: there are 3 divisions. Im markiv davar she'ein someach elashi nivla be'ilan. Now, how then, according to Rishon Zalman, would you deal with the Gemara in Pesachim, which does seem to allow you to inject this, genetic material into the plant, right? That seems to be what's going on in Pesachim. How do you deal with that? So here, Chazon Ish has multiple layers, which might help us. He says, there are 3 categories. Im markiv davar she'ein someach elishiv nivla be'ilan u'meitiv smicha l'elen mutar. It's just going to be something that's not itself that in itself can't grow, but it strengthens the plant, so then it's permitted. Because then you're not changing the identity, you're adding like fertilizer, essentially. V'hainu hadamar psachim ninvav, he says, psachim ninvav is not creating a new species. What is it doing? It's like giving something plant food. Right? Whatever that mixture of beer and whatever they put in was, that was not changing the identity of the plant. Right? That was just giving it, right, plant food. So that's fine. He said, everyone agrees that's fine. V'hainu damar v'psachim davnin vav, Amar Aleph, the notlin, the leva dekel asa dor v'shechor the dafna v'kimcha the sar v'loshrin mishumenin be'ilon v'yarak v'ino. He said it doesn't give you a new plant, it just strengthens it. So that's what's matter in the Yerushalmi. That's category 1. The yesh me'arkiv shemetachin molidin, that's what it is. Molidin min chadash. V'yesh me'arkiv v'aperi eina mishtaneh. Shnei ha'kavei l'isurin. But he said there are 2 other things. And that's where you create a new min, a new species, or even where the genetic material does combine, even if it doesn't necessarily change. He says that's usher. So you have the Chazon Ish, like Rishon Zalman, says, look, the Gemara in Pesachim, I'll read it away. That's not talking about genetic engineering. That's talking about giving something essentially fertilizer. That's obviously mutter. But if you're actually joining genetic material, whether or not it creates a new species, that he thinks is already usher. You're adding chiluk barkava ben markiv guf markiv sraf, and he says, I don't think there's a difference between combining 2 species, the bodies of them by grafting, or combining them through the sap, or wherever you do it. Shim notel sraf no bisdak uchozer b'osanaf, because if I were to put sap in a crack in the tree, and that would create a new branch. That would be grafting, essentially. She'ein be'edimot something bein ha'av, since it has the possibility to create new things, to give birth, as it were, it's called grafting. V'lodomi l'arba'a shein is served into a zera shel min zel min acher. The other half the aver talush ein bo mishum arba'a shein vado ela b'chai. But like Rosh Hashanah, he says this is only true by plants, because by animals, even inseminating an animal wouldn't violate Kilayim. It would only be if you actually crossbred them. So, like Rosh Hashanah, so what you have so far is, basically we have the question, how do you imagine the Isser of Kilayim Behema and Kilayim Ziring? Is it about the result of having joined together two species and created something new, or is it about the act of crossbreeding or cross-planting and grafting? So, Rabachi Daron says, in everything, it's just the act. Proof, the Gemara in Pesachim, where they seem to have been putting other species into the heart of the tree. So therefore, he says it's all about the act. If it doesn't, and therefore genetically engineering something is always going to be permitted, because you're not doing the act of grafting or crossbreeding. You're just creating the result, and that's fine. The Chazon Ish says no. It's the result. But what result? So he says if it's just strengthening the plants, it's like giving fertilizer, that's obviously permitted. But if you're creating a new species, or alternatively, you are simply joining the genetic material, so then he says, why is that different? Why is joining the saps of two trees to create something new different than grafting? Now, based on this, and this is where I think, Akiva Wolf picks up, and I think he might be right in both the Rosh Hashanah and the Chazon Ish, is that since the Chazon Ish says it's about the result from having joined the saps together, it does seem to be that he thinks that it's not just having created a new species, it's creating a new species by joining the sap. And that's why it seems to be, as Akiva Wolf is medayek, that it's only the original, right? The original material from the plant. But once you've duplicated it, right, it doesn't seem to be that simply creating new species without the presence of actual material from the original plant is going to be problematic. And that's why maybe the Isser of the Chazon Ish and the Rosh Hashanah is going to be limited to the original case, and not when you're producing this genetic modification with duplicate genetic material. Okay. Let's assume that it is permitted, though. Is it hashkafically problematic? Okay, meta-halachically problematic. So this belongs to a host of sugyot that basically are the playing God sugyos, right? And there are a lot of modern halachic issues where the poskim weigh in on whether it's hashkafically problematic because you are playing God. Now, where do they get the notion that there's a problem of playing God? So they get it from Ramban's understanding of the Isser Kilayim in general. So why is it usher in general to crossbreed an animal? So Rashi says, in number 10, what does that mean? It's a decree, God said it, that's it. The Ramban says no, in 11, Hatam b'kilayim, ki Hashem bara minim ba'olam, b'chol ba'alei nevashot b'tzrachim ba'alei nefesh hatznu'ah. God created species, animals, and plants, v'natan b'hem kol ha'oladah, ha'toladah shekaymu aminim b'hem, and he gave them the power to procreate so that their species would exist forever, la'ad, kol zman she'yirtzeh yitbarach b'kiyum ha'olam, as long as God wants the world to exist. And he gave them the power to produce their own species. And never change. As it says by every species, it was created according to its own species. This is why people procreate. And one who crossbreeds. He challenges the notion of creation. As if God did not create the world as is perfect. As if you want to add to the world new creations. Chayim lo yidu min rishenu bino. Right? Creatures can't normally create other species, etc. And after the ellipsis, umechavarenu mostif b'dam kilayim ku shelo la'arbeva kachonim magdalim atzmchim le'anavim zemizeh min hasham b'reshit rabba amar Rabbi Simon ein lechol kol ezev v'lamate shen bo mazel berakil mako tov omer lo gadel. Maybe there's also some sort of metaphysical problem because things are being told to grow by their mazel, etc. But the Ramban introduces a notion, which admittedly is only one of the possibilities in the Ramban, and it's not clear how serious to take it halachically, but his philosophical rationale for all these prohibitions of Kilayim is essentially don't play God. God creates certain species, and that's what he wants in the world. And therefore, there are many poskim in other sugyot, and a lot of these who say, look, even if something might not be halachically asur, it runs against the spirit of the law of playing God. Now, admittedly, that's problematic, because first of all, it's not clear how seriously the Ramban would mean it in la halacha. Two is the Ramban himself gives other philosophical reasons for Kilayim. And three, Rashi just says it's a Gzerat HaKatuv, a Gzerat Melech. And it's not based on the philosophy, right? It's not a problem of playing God. And there are other sources that imply that you should be able to. But nevertheless, this does become, for many poskim, the reason that they think you maybe shouldn't do this is if this argument is brought up in the cloning sugya. It's brought up in the question of choosing the sex of a child through IVF and IUI and all the different ways of artificial reproductive technology. A lot of poskim have this meta-halachic conviction that you shouldn't be allowed to play God. Okay. So there is that possibility, even if it doesn't fall into the technical halachic one, maybe you would say that it is problematic hashkafically. Okay, let's say you do think it's halachically problematic. Is it problematic only for Jews or even for non-Jews? So what do you think? First glance, you would say it's only problem for Jews, because it's not in the Sheva Mitzvah B'nai Noach, right? Which are, right, Ibram and Achai, Birkat Hashem, Gezel, Dinim, Hereg, Avodah Zarah, Znut, etc. Kilayim is not one of them. However, if you look at number 12, there is one position in the Gemara, Rabbi Elazar Omer, Aval Kilayim. Rabbi Elazar says that one of the Sheva Mitzvah B'nai Noach, not Sheva, there's more than 7 according to Rabbi Elazar. They're also prohibited in Kilayim, not in wearing it. Mutarin B'nai Noach lo bosh Kilayim, one second. They're allowed to wear shatnez, lezroa Kilayim, and to plant them, v'ein asur el barbat behema v'agav ilan. But grafting trees and crossbreeding animals, Rabbi Elazar says, even non-Jews are forbidden from. Yeah.
So this isn't one of the 7, but if it is,
Correct. According to Rabbi Elazar, there's 8.
So are there others? Are there?
Yes, there are others in the Gemara. The Gemara there has the 7, and then as Rabbi Elazar adds another one, and someone else adds magic. Right? There's a few others that possibly get introduced there, and one of them is Kilayim. Now, do we paskin like Rabbi Elazar? So this is an interesting question. So if you look at 14. The Rambam very clearly paskins, we don't. Al Shisha Dvarim Nitzava Adam Arishon. 6 commandments were given to Adam. Al Avodah Zarah, Al Birkat Hashem, Al Shvichut Damim, Al Gilui Arayot, Al Gezel, Al Adinim, Avo Bishikulan En Kabbalah Bi'Avinu Mimoshe Rabbeinu, V'De'at Noteh Lahen, Michal Dvar Torah, Divrei Torah, Yiresh Al Elu Nitzavu, Hosef L'Noach, Avram and Achai Shnamach Basar B'Nafsho, Gam Al Lotech Elu, Nimtzah Sheva Mitzvot. Right, the Rambam says 6 to Adam, 1 to Noah, total 7, end of story. Yeah.
How can I expect them to do a vote?
Meaning, according to the Rambam, it's not a problem. Non-Jews have to keep Shem Mitzvah Noah, not because they feel that it's right, but because they know Moshe commanded it. Right? So if you have that type of idea, so then Moshe, whatever Moshe commanded them. Yeah, but according to the Rambam, it's not about coming to it logically. They have to believe in Torah Mitinai, and then accept it from there. So according to the Rambam, it's not a problem. If you don't believe that, if you think it's more natural law, so then you're right, you'll have a problem, and maybe that's part of the machloket there. Maybe, though, it's unclear whether Sheva Mitzvot logically fit a category of natural law. Right? Christine Hayes has a long discussion of this in her book on what's divine about divine law. And one of the things she highlights is the fact there are machlokat about it. Right? If you identify the Shem mitzvah with natural law, there shouldn't be machlokot about it because it should be the things that are self-evident. And yes, putting a chok in there would throw a wrench in the theory that Shem mitzvah is just another way of saying natural law.
Are some of them, are some of them not questioned? Like silly? Is that?
The 7 are not questioned. The 7, I mean, they look for the source, but they're basically agreed upon. The others are challenged, right? Kilayim and magic and maybe staka, right? They all appear in those sugyas there. So the Rambam in Perek Tet of Malachim Paskin, only 7, which you would assume that means non-Jews are not forbidden in it. However, the Rambam in Malachim Yud Vav seems to paskin that it is usher. So you look at 13, he says, "Mipia Kabbalah shebnei Noach asurin b'arbat ve'ima b'rakad elan bilvat ve'neregen alein." The Kabbalah is that they are forbidden. It's not one of the 7 that gets the death penalty, or for which they're chayav mitah, but it is forbidden for them to crossbreed animals or fruit. So there is a little bit of a tension, right? Is it just a contradiction in the Rambam, or does the Rambam say there are 7 that have the death penalty and some others that don't have the death penalty, but they're obligated in anyways? Shulchan Aruch does seem to say that it's forbidden. If you look at 15, Shulchan Aruch seems to be machmer asur l'zrok kilayim lo ve'kol chavit. But the Shach writes, not so fast. Shulchan Aruch might not actually prohibit it for non-Jews. Maybe the Shulchan Aruch only thinks that a Jew can't tell a non-Jew to do it. Right? He says, "Bebeit Yosef v'ter zahav u'bach katu atam mishum amira lo ve'kol chavim shvut." It's usher because you aren't allowed to tell a non-Jew to do something usher, just like on Shabbat. Kamoshi Yitbayer. And therefore, all that you would derive from it is that if you think it's usher, it would be usher for you to tell a non-Jew to do it, but not for the non-Jew to do it of his own accord. However, he notes, but the Drisha says, but the Drisha paskins like the other Rambam in Perek Yud, and says, no, it's usher even for non-Jews to do it themselves. And the Shach himself says, I can't believe he ever said such a thing. We think there are only 7. It's too low, no more. It's true that Elazar paskins that. That should be Perek Tet. Ain't some low remez or remizan, but other of the Abraham Perek Tet, Melchot Melachim, before the Edel, and Tavo B'Sheva Mitzvot, etc. V'hu Pashut. Right? So in the end of the day, if you think it's usher, is it usher even for non-Jews or only for Jews? So again, even for Jews, Rabaki their own says it's mutter to create. Because the only problem is where you actually are grafting rather than just creating the results. Shlomo Zalman and the Chazon Ish say it is usher, but maybe, as Akiva Wolf points out, only the original material, but not the duplicates. If you think it's usher for Jews or non-Jews. So, if you think it's only Shem Mitzvah Noach, it's only for Jews. If you think that we passing like Rabbi Elazar, that even non-Jews can't do Harvat Ilana Behema, it would be usher even for non-Jews. The Rambam, there seems to be a little bit of a tension. How do we paskin? So Shulchan Aruch says it's usher, but the majority of Achronim, like the Shach knows, assume that non-Jews are permitted. They just can't have a Jew tell them, please create this for me. Then that's usher. The Drisha, the Paskins, like the simple understanding, the Rambam very good, and says if it is prohibited even for non-Jews, and therefore if you think that creating genetically modified foods in this way is prohibited, then according to the Drisha, it would be usher not only for Jews but for non-Jews as well. Okay. So that's the basic issue. And then, again, as we said, in addition to the halachic issues, there is the meta-halachic issue of maybe it is the more in the spirit of the law of playing God, which, as I said, that's unclear, because Rashi thinks it's only a chok, even the Ramban has different reasons for the mitzvah, and again, it's only the Tama mitzvah, it's only the philosophy, it's unclear what implications that should have in law, but that is something that's brought up by many poskim in these similar categories. That is another factor to take into account. Okay?